Street photography often requires you to have very, very fast reactions in order to capture a scene or a moment that's just happening in front of you. And often you don't have time to adjust your camera or make any changes to the setting. So in these situations, it's very important to have your camera preset and ready to go so that you can minimize the number of shots that you missed because you weren't ready or you weren't prepared. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you my specific settings that I use to capture those unexpected moments that happen suddenly without notice or warning. And by having your camera ready to go straight away, hopefully you'll never miss a single shot. So let's get into it. So before we get started, it is very important to say that there is no right or wrong settings for your camera. People have different preferences, different situations that they shoot in, different styles of photography. So if you're happy with the settings you have and you manage to get great shots, then by all means, please keep with those and don't worry about changing settings to the ones that I'm suggesting. These are just the ones that work for me personally very well, and they might do for you as well. So for my candid street photos, my main camera is the Leica Q2, which has been replaced now by the Leica Q3, but they're very, very similar. It's a 28mm fixed lens, so I can't change the focal length. It's quite a wide lens, but for me that works really well because it allows me to capture a whole scene with some context, not just a head and shoulders shot. And for times when I'm quite close and I want to shoot from the hip or without being noticed, by having the wide angle, it enables me to be able to take a shot without even looking through the viewfinder. I can just click away and be fairly certain that I've captured the subject in the frame, which might require a little bit of cropping in order to make it look a little bit better. So in order to make sure that everything is in focus, because I don't have time to focus before shooting, I use a relatively small aperture, so either f8 or f11. What that means is that gives me a lot of leeway in terms of whether the subject is fairly close to me or a little bit further away. I can still make sure that they'll all be in acceptable focus. And then to avoid motion blur, I need a relatively fast shutter speed. So motion blur can be either the subject moving, if they're moving very quickly, or even camera shake. So especially if I'm trying to be quick, I might be moving the camera up to eye level or close to eye level at the same time as I'm clicking the shutter. So there can be some motion blur from the camera movement, or camera shake as it's called. And so for that reason I use a fast shutter speed, so roughly 1/250th of a second, or at a push 1/125, which is slightly slower but still normally fast enough to freeze any movement as long as the subject isn't moving too quickly. So in terms of the focusing distance, I usually focus at roughly 1.5 meters. So what that means is that anything slightly closer than 1.5 meters and all the way back to several meters away will be in reasonably acceptable focus. So that's a nice middle ground. Again, it depends on the kind of photography you're doing. If you're not normally that close to the subject, you might want to set the focus distance at 2 meters or even 2.5 or 3 meters away. But for me, sometimes I'm very close to the subject, so 1.5 is about right. And if it's slightly closer, if the subject is slightly closer, I know that it's still going to be in focus because I'm using a very small aperture, which gives me a wider depth of field. And then if you understand exposure triangles, you'll know that apart from aperture and shutter speed, there is one other factor that affects the amount of light that's let into the sensor or registered on the sensor, and that's the ISO. That's the light sensitivity, and that's the one that for me I set to automatic. And the reason I set that to automatic is because for me the shutter speed and the aperture are the two more important things in terms of capturing that image. If the shutter speed is too slow, I'll get motion blur and I might find the photo unusable. If the aperture is too wide, say f2.8, then the depth of field will be too shallow, and I might find that the subject is simply out of focus because they're either too far away or too close to the camera, and the narrow depth of field doesn't allow for that variation in the distance. So by having the ISO set to automatic, it does mean that if the light is not very strong, the camera will select a very high ISO, so for example 3200 or even 6400, which can introduce some noise. But for me, out of those three things, noise is the least problematic, because if a photo is out of focus, then it's unusable in most cases unless you deliberately want to have some blur in that image, and that can happen sometimes. But in most cases you don't want your image to be too blurry. But with a bit of noise, it can add some atmosphere, it can add a little bit of a grainy look to the image, which can be okay. But also with today's modern software like Photoshop and Lightroom, it's very easy to reduce the noise or get rid of most of the noise that results from having a high ISO. There are now, of course, lots of new apps and AI tools that can actually fix motion blur and blur in photos in general. But I think overall it's still easier to fix noise than it is to fix motion blur. And so that's why, for me, having the automatic ISO is the best option. On this camera, I do have the option of limiting the ISO at a maximum range, and I do that. So I have the ISO set at automatic, but the maximum is 6400. So anything more than that and the camera will just stop at 6400, and so it'll usually lower the shutter speed in order to compensate for the lack of ISO. And in those situations I might end up with an unusable shot, but that's just because the lighting conditions are really not conducive to taking the photo. Now, just in case, if you do have a camera which doesn't allow you to set a specific distance for focusing, say at 1.5 meters, what you can do, this is the old Canon 5D, and the 50mm doesn't have a focusing distance measurement on the lens. What you can do is you can set it to autofocus, for example, and then you find a subject like a tree or something that's, say, roughly 1.5 meters or 2 meters away, and you focus on that using the autofocus. And then once you've got that focus, you just switch it back to manual focus so that it will no longer move. It will be set at 1.5 forever until you move it again, and then you can actually then just take the photos in that way, just like you would with the manual focus lens. And so really that's it. That's my settings that I used combined with zone focusing technique to capture images very, very quickly without having to set anything on my camera before taking the picture. So you're basically using the camera as almost a point and shoot camera, but really you've made the settings yourself in advance. And if you'd like to know in more detail about zone focusing, I've done a video here which you can look at next, where I go into quite a lot of detail about how to do zone focusing and how to use zone focusing to great effect for street photography. So thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what settings you prefer to use in your street photography, and I'll see you in the next one.